Welcome to the first episode of our Star Trek Retrospective. In this inaugural episode, we will be talking about the original series movies from Star Trek I to Star Trek VI. I am your host, David Wright. Joining me is your mandated reporter, and frankly he's mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. How do you do, sir?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on this inaugural Star Trek Retrospective podcast.
Thanks for being here. Next, we have the founder of the Canadian office of the former Radulich and Broadcasting Network, Mr. Andrew Graham.
Good evening, everyone. The beer this evening is Wild Rose Brewery's Barracks Brown, a taste of Calgary. That's not its motto, but it should be.
Oh, great. Now William Shatner's going to complain about our product placement on Twitter. Last, but most certainly not least, is one of the original co-hosts of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network, the long-suffering Mr. Robert Winfree.
You know, I wish I had a bit, but I'm not entirely sure which Star Trek character I would be analogous to in this particular assemblage of humanity.
McCoy.
Fair enough. Then
Are we sure that's not Pat?
Pat's probably much more Scotty. Look, Pat's the guy who would drink someone under the table in service to the greater plan. I'm the guy who would tell you, damn it, Mark, I'm a podcast host, not a film critic.
Doesn't all this, does that make me Kirk? Because I'm definitely not Picard.
You're not Kirk. Who's like the second worst captain?
Oh.
Ooh,
I'm Janeway?
No, Janeway's not the second worst captain.
I mean, they haven't promoted Michael Burnham yet, so...
I was going to say Scott Bakula.
Who's Harry Kim?
I want to be Janeway. I want to try to crash my ship every other episode.
Okay, fine, you can be Janeway.
Woohoo!
We are a very progressive podcast.
I identify as a female Starfleet captain.
I once had a friend who started growing out a beard and referred to it as the full Riker, and since at the same time I was pretty much losing my hair, so I said, "So does this mean I outrank you?"
The answer is yes to that question.
For those of you who are still with us, which is a phrase that should really be put on the Radulich bingo card at this point.
For those of you who are still with us, we salute you.
If Mindy's gonna put anything on a t-shirt, it should be that.
All right, gentlemen, I'd like to go on the record right now. I am updating the bingo card.
So today we are doing the TOS movies, so Star Treks 1 through 6. So I'm going to start off with a brief spiel on background of the film in question, try to get through a relevant summary as quickly as possible, and then we're just going to start discussing this thing, hopefully in a semi-coherent and organized fashion. So without further ado, let's start with Star Trek The Motion Picture, released in 1979. George Lucas and ILM have just blown the doors off of what's possible with special effects, especially in terms of space movies, and everyone's looking to get a sweet piece of that pie. So Paramount looks like, what have we got in the coffers? Hey, we got this Star Trek show. Let's make a movie out of that. They dragged Gene Roddenberry out of semi-retirement, got the old crew back together, and tried to come up with a script, which was a complete and total mess. So this was pretty much a troubled production from start to finish. They were filming the film before the ending was written. There was numerous ideas on what to do. Scripts were sent back. It was just a complete and total mess. They were going to make it a lead off into a new Star Trek TV show with the same ship but different characters. Then that fell through. So we had a complete mess of new characters being relevant and then not relevant, and old characters being relevant and not relevant. And we end up with Star Trek The Motion Picture, where a giant space cloud is heading straight for the Earth, and Admiral Kirk and the rest of the Enterprise crew have to take the newly refitted Enterprise, because the original model was not detailed enough for the big screen, and its new crew, to take over in Star Trek Phase 2, to stop the cloud before it destroys the Earth. Kirk butts head with Decker, the new captain of the Enterprise. As they enter the cloud, they find a giant ship inside. An alien probe that looks like a bolt of lightning appears on the bridge and vaporizes Ilea, Decker's old flame. Ilea comes back rebuilt as a biological probe with the shortest miniskirt in film history to communicate with the Enterprise crew.
Look, that's what turns an ordinary voyage into a fantastic voyage, right?
She tells them that the entity in control of the ship is called V'ger, and it is going to Earth to merge with the Creator. The Enterprise, after an eternity, reaches the core of V'ger, where the crew discovers that V'ger is actually an old Voyager space probe. Spock figures that the probe fell through a wormhole and made contact with a planet of sentient machines, that somehow didn't need to call a Lovecraftian robot squid to destroy all organic life in the universe. They try to access V'ger's data inputs, but it shorts them out, wanting to directly merge with the creator. Decker volunteers to be with Ilea, and because Star Trek Phase 2 was cancelled. So Decker, Ilea, and V'ger merge, and V'ger disappears. Once again, Kirk and the crew have saved the universe.
So can I blame this monstrosity for thropples, then?
Mark, your thoughts first, sir.
So I rewatched this again recently, and it's not as bad as I remember. I think its biggest problem is that even back in the late 70s, early 80s, when you went to go see a Star Trek film, you wanted to see Kirk, Spock, and McCoy go on crazy adventures. And a large portion of this movie deals with Decker and Ilea, which was not the formula for a jump from TV to major motion picture. First, you don't know who the hell Decker is. You know even less about who the hell Ilea is. And halfway through the movie, she disappears and becomes a robot. So I think average audiences struggled with this movie. Then you take the fact that it's classic 1970s science fiction, which means it's slow and it's boring. There's the problem of not having a proper villain. They'll fix a lot of this when they do the same plot, only this time it's whales in Star Trek 4. For a major motion picture, you have to have some action going on the screen, and I think they try at times. They definitely build tension for a late 70s sci-fi film, but it's not the kind of movie-going experience, especially in the wake of Star Wars. It's not the kind of movie-going experience that a general audience would take to in large numbers. I think upon rewatch, what becomes very clear to me about Star Trek the Motion Picture is the failure in understanding, which they'll correct with the next movie, in understanding the scope of the medium they're producing art for. That's a fancy way of saying they took the Star Trek television show and translated it into a major motion picture, when what they should have done is just make a motion picture with Star Trek characters. You might be like, well, what's the difference? This feels like a long episode of Star Trek TOS. Star Trek the Motion Picture just feels like another day at the office for the TOS gang in an extended, like, made-for-TV movie. Whereas the next one, the best one that we're going to talk about, Star Trek 2, feels like a grand motion picture experience. Like they learned from their previous mistakes and corrected all of them in spades with Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Kahn.
Andrew, anything to say in addition to that?
I think Mark kind of hit a lot of the points. I mean, this is probably one of the ones I've seen the fewest number of times. I rewatched it the other night, and I think my biggest problem with it, and I think Mark hits it, and I'll take it one step further, is that this thing feels like a lot of Trek episodes, only extended much longer and done in, I'd say, an inferior way. I mean, I think you look at an episode like The Next Generation, Tin Man, something similar along that line, where they've done it before. They've done kind of a similar sentient machine, sentient life form, evolving and moving on story, and they've done it better. That said, I mean, this is a draggy movie. Like it, I think, Dave, you and I were talking about this the other night while I was doing the rewatch. I think it was 27 minutes before they even had the transporter accident, which doesn't really serve any other purpose than to just show that the Enterprise isn't working. And there's a lot of these kind of little episodic pieces, like the transporter accident, the wormhole thing. It doesn't hang together as a coherent narrative. And in a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of some of the stories I've heard through a documentary called Chaos on the Bridge, on basically how the first episode of Next Gen came together, and how at the end of the episode, I didn't really know what it was about, or the end of the movie, rather.
Robert.
Who directed this?
Robert Wise.
Has that particular gentleman done anything else of note?
No, he directed Run Silent, Run Deep, Sand Pebbles. He directed The Sound of Music.
Yes! Now I'm much more
West Side
into this.
Story, too.
Oh, everything is making so much more sense now.
Okay, hold on. No. First of all, he didn't actually direct West Side Story. He came in and did finishing work. The actual director of West Side Story doesn't actually get as much credit because he could barely tolerate printing dance sequences with... I mean, the original director is actually a very famous Broadway dance choreographer.
Oh, okay.
This guy is incredibly steeped in the style of the 70s. I feel like between the troubled production and the studio notes this guy got being, do a Stanley Kubrick, because good Lord, I love Kubrick's work, but if you don't have that kind of singular cohesive vision to tie together all of the disparate parts, it really doesn't work. This feels like a bad Kubrick impression, and that's really the only kind of thing from a style standpoint I can say about it. It bounces around between a few too many characters. It is so slow. This movie is just boring. And I'm not a guy who demands that the keys be jingled every 5 seconds. I can sink my teeth into a movie. This is a boring movie. There's so much nothing. This movie lacked editing. It lacked vision. The script is all over the place. In all honesty, it's a miracle it's as coherent as it is when you look into just how screwed up the production of this thing was, which might be damning with the faintest of praise, but I'll do it anyway. It's also a testament to how beloved the franchise is that it was able to survive this atrocity. Because this same kind of a catastrophic screw-up in almost any other niche product, and let's be very clear, Star Trek, especially in the 70s, niche product, and you'd be dead. You would be dead in the water. You'd be floating along waiting for some grizzled old cop to kind of crouch down over you when you wash up on the beach. You'd be dead. The effects, such as they are pretty good. I do want to give them credit for doing what they could with this from a purely special effects perspective. But this isn't an effects demo reel. It's supposed to be a movie. And on that level, it tends to fail pretty hard.
Can I ask you a question, sir?
All right.
Do you think in addition to sort of a ticking time clock that was V'ger, if there had been another alien race, not Klingons, I think Klingons are a little overdone, and considering they're going to be the villains of the next subsequent series of movies, had there been like Romulans or some other known threat that was also menacing them with this cloud and produced a couple of action sequences, do you think the movie would have benefited by and large and we'd be talking about a completely different experience? Because I did.
I mean, it wouldn't have hurt, but at the same time, it would have added to the runtime.
I think if you...
Okay, hold on. This guy directed the original The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Really?
If they cut down on the Kubrick and added more of the Michael Bay, I think you have a better picture here. It's the first one I could think of that goes with the boom boom and the woo.
And that makes me weep for you.
Mark's not wrong, though. Like, there are a lot of lingering shots in this movie that just go on for way too long.
I don't disagree with that at all.
And I'll actually say, when I was rewatching it, I think some of the effects around V'ger and stuff like that were really good and still held up pretty well. I was watching this in Blu-ray. But I found some of the ship effects not to be so great. You could definitely tell there were times when they were just moving ship across screen as opposed to actually, like, putting it properly on a motion rig and get it to move with a little bit of angle. That actually makes it look like it's flying. Like, you compare what this looks like to what Star Wars looked like, and it's night and day.
Yeah, I completely agree there. And again, I don't disagree that this movie needed proper editing and it needed more to happen. I mean, I don't even think you necessarily need another alien race. Partway through their voyage through the cloud, just have V'ger's like defense system activate independent of Ilya's control or whatever, and have them have to fight off part of the ship. Like, there's stuff you could do.
So in other words, keep the villain V'ger, but V'ger has drones, essentially, they could have thrown at the Enterprise.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or what I would think is maybe combine some of those ideas. So V'ger starts off farther away from Earth, and it's sort of them having to, almost like a Godzilla movie, where like they have to keep trying things at each defensive line to try and stop V'ger, and at every turn it doesn't work until finally their last Hail Mary passes. Let's just fly the Enterprise into this thing and see what we can figure out, and just have that be like the last 30 minutes of the film instead of it being
the last 90 minutes.
The last 90 minutes, exactly. Yeah, when I first watched the motion picture, I didn't like it at all. Like you say, it's so slow. Very little happens, and the uniforms are terrible.
Oh, God.
Like, I think the only cast member who actually...
the bathrobes?
Yeah,
my problem with them was that they were piss yellow in some cases.
So much beige.
Yeah, beige and white.
Yeah, they went with Bed Bath & Beyond colors for some odd reason. My other problem is they also look like they're wearing pajamas.
Yeah, I don't know what was with the 70s and everything being creamy yellow and brown. Really, those are the two colors you guys went with for the decade?
I do quite enjoy
Look, I blame the hippies.
I was about to say, I really enjoyed the scene where they pull Dr. McCoy out of being a roadie for Creedence Clearwater Revival.
I did enjoy when McCoy broke into Down on the Corner, Down in the Street.
More like they're flying around. It ain't me. It ain't me. Speaking of music, I will say there's one absolute positive on this movie, and that is Jerry Goldsmith's score, which basically defines Star Trek. I'd say, basically the last 40 years.
I buy
Agreed.
that.
I would say that this film, in some ways, might be one of the most Star Trek of the Star Trek films in that it's not an action movie. It is more about going into the unknown and trying to figure things out through caution and observation and even a little bit of science. Like, they cannot overpower V'ger. We had, the 3 Klingon battle cruisers attack at the beginning of the film, and they're just completely destroyed, without any effort. We can't blow it up. That is not a solution to the problem. So we're going to have to tread very carefully and approach this as explorers, figuring out what this thing is, what it wants, and how we can stop it from destroying the Earth. From that perspective, I think it's very unique in the Parthenon of Star Trek films, but it all falls apart and it's just so long and boring. And that goes down to the special effects, where I think it was just this giant special effects gasm of, holy smokes, we can actually do all this stuff now with all this special effects. We need to have that on screen for as much as possible, and it strangles the film to death, just how slow it is watching the ship just fly and fly and fly. Terrific model work. Really, really well done. Really neat designs, but it's just too much of it. We needed it to be a bit more spectacular over less time.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yep.
In Kirk's defense, this is his first time dealing with a homicidal probe upgraded by an alien intelligence. There was also the episode The Changeling from TOS. He also had to deal with a godlike probe that wanted to go to Earth and kill everyone.
Here's my thing with the motion picture. It's not a bad idea. It's a great idea for a television show, for like a made-for-TV movie. It's not a bad idea for a major motion picture. Competitively with Star Wars, they missed the finer points of what made Star Wars work. If you're trying to do Stanley Kubrick, the question then has to be asked, well, who's your fucking audience for this thing? Is it Kubrick fans or is it Star Trek fans? And sure, in some cases the twain shall meet, but not in all cases. And I think that's...
Not to cut you off, but if you're going to go with a Kubrick impression, you cannot have this many cooks in the kitchen. People forget all... I think one thing people dramatically did not appreciate about Kubrick's filmmaking at the time is the benefit of singular vision. That's his movie from start to finish. He writes it, he shoots it, he edits it, and that's it. Here you have this poor guy who has some competency as a director, now that I look up the totality of his filmography, but does not seem good at managing chaos. If everything goes relatively smoothly, he will give you a very, very competent product. Although there's some very real arguments about the scenes that he wound up shooting for West Side Story being the weakest in that entire movie. I tend to agree with, by the way. But he's competent enough to get you where you need to go, and the smoother the ride is, the better he performs. This movie is The Rock and Seann William Scott falling down the side of a cliff for 4 minutes.
Hey, I love that movie.
So do I. Look, if the Rundown comes out in the 1980s, we now talk about it as one of the best buddy action movies of all time.
Rundown.
Well, we're going to talk more about cliffs later. Okay, so any other final thoughts on Star Trek, the motion picture, otherwise known as the motionless picture?
I think if you're either high or you're prepared to watch a 70s movie, and for those of you, if your kids are listening to this here podcast full of old men reflecting on film, when I say 70s, in the 70s, you're getting the just out of film school class. This is Spielberg and Lucas and Kubrick. These were people who, when film was art, took time with scenes. And so between your Dog Day Afternoons and your 2001s and your Deer Hunters, these were films that the scenes could take breaths. There was time in these scenes. There's longing camera shots of people in deep reflection. If you're a child and you're watching these, you're bored stiff. If you're a film junkie, you're like, wow, look at that camera angle. You have to be in the mood for it. If you're wanting to see shake your ass, watch yourself, okay, put on any Michael Bay film and you'll be fine. But if you're wanting to study film, the class of the 70s, of which this sits directly in, are good films to watch. You just have to be in the mood for it. When I watched Star Trek the Motion Picture this time around, granted, I'm also a 44-year-old man, I was ready for it. I was ready to sit and watch the camera be still. I was ready for performances that were not going to jump off the screen. Muted performances. I was ready for a 70s experience. And that's what I got. And so I think if you contextualized it by the time in which it was made, it's not as bad as I think it gets credited as being. I think what happens is people look back on it and go, we go from long shots of the Enterprise going through V'ger to 50 years later, and they're shooting aliens to the sound of Sabotage by the Beastie Boys. Shit's changed, man!
God, I hate that movie.
That's a different podcast.
I have one quick final note on this one. Just going back to the conversation that you and I had the other night, Dave. So one other quick thing that maybe goes to the ponderous pace of this movie is the way the background of both of the writers, Harold Livingston and Ellen Dean Foster, they were both actually primarily novelists, not screenwriters. I think they were fine with letting their book instincts go into the screenwriting side of things, but in this case, there's no option to flip a few pages forward in a theater.
Okay, everyone good?
Aye, aye, Captain.
Okay, despite all that, the Star Trek motion picture made enough money to justify a sequel a few years later. That fell down to Harve Bennett to write the story and Nicholas Meyer to direct. So Harve Bennett sat down, got all of the original series episodes together, and watched the show and went, oh, okay, I get what this is. And unlike current Star Trek writers, he was right. So he realized that Star Trek is just this vehicle that you can use to tell sort of a story of any sort of message or substance that you want. It's a way of critiquing on life and humanity. It just uses the sci-fi trappings to enable you to explore it in almost infinite ways. In particular, he noticed the episode Space Seed, where the Enterprise comes across an old cryo ship from before warp travel and unfreezes its occupants and realizes eventually that they have thawed out Khan Noonien Singh, a ancient dictator from Earth history, future for us, who was genetically engineered and thus saw himself as inherently genetically superior to all other humans and set about establishing his own new world order with a genetically superior hierarchy on it, which was never mentioned in Star Trek Into Darkness, which would have really helped.
The number of things that would have helped that movie is long.
Yeah, well, we'll have to save that for later. So at the end of the episode, Kirk is able to best Khan and leaves him stranded on a planet, Ceti Alpha 5, I believe. Said, we'll check up on you, but you being a tough Ubermensch, you can build your new civilization from the ground up. And Khan's like, oh, that sounds fun. Yeah, Harve Bennett thought of and thought, there's an interesting story to be told with what could happen after that. And so we get Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn, which starts off with the USS Reliant, a smaller ship than the Enterprise, being sent to look in on the Genesis project, and in that process they go and look into the planet Ceti Alpha 6. However, they learn that Ceti Alpha 6 exploded, and the orbit of Ceti Alpha 5 moved into it. And since it's farther away from the sun in this case, then the climate of the planet shifted, so instead of it being a lush, harsh, but livable place to basically being a frozen desert world. We find that Khan and some of his followers have managed to survive, and Khan's a little bit bitter about being left on his own with no one even bothering to check out if his planet was even in the same orbit. So swears revenge. He uses the last surviving organism on the planet, which conveniently allows him to mind control people by sticking slugs in their ears, which is super convenient. He takes command of the Reliant as Kirk and the Enterprise are sent to check up on things. Khan pretends to be a Federation ship, gets close enough to the Enterprise, and starts shooting at them. Kirk, confronted with Khan, using his superior knowledge of Starfleet ships and their command codes, is able to get a counterattack in on Khan. Ships go away to lick their wounds. He finds that Khan has stolen the Genesis device, which is a device that will instantly terraform any planet, including overwriting whatever was on the planet before, and could make for a very powerful weapon. Khan's first officer, Joachim, comes to him and tells him, hey, you've beat Kirk, you've left his ship broken and defenseless, you have the Genesis device, you have shown yourself to be the Superman of the two, let's go off, the galaxy is our oyster. And Khan's like, no, he tests me and I must have him. Starts quoting Moby Dick. He will not give up the hunt. Kirk and the Enterprise have had enough time to rebuild enough. They end up dragging Khan into a nebula where Kirk, using three-dimensional maneuvering, figuring Khan is more of a two-dimensional guy due to him being from the past, is able to get the jump on Khan, disable the Reliant, and as the ship's about to explode, Khan turns on the Genesis device in his one last screw you to Kirk. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. In the battle, the Enterprise's warp drive has been disabled, and the only way to fix it is by going right into the warp core and fixing things, which would give you a lethal dose of radiation. Spock decides to go in because Leonard Nimoy had such a terrible experience working on the last film that he never wants to do Star Trek again. He wants his character to die in this one, so he does.
That'll alert him.
Kirk, who's been struggling with the onset of old age in this, has realized that he was still able to go up against Khan, a very intelligent and ruthless adversary, and triumph on top, saving the galaxy once again, announces that he feels young, and roll credits. Andrew, would you like to start for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn?
Sure thing. I mean, what is there to say? I mean, this is one of those, it's a movie that's become a little bit of a reference and a little bit of a rote, but that's because it originated a lot of this stuff. I mean, it did so many things right in terms of being able to tie in a personal character arc into the story. It kind of hit that right balance of having an interesting concept with the introduction of the Genesis device and the implications around that. It also brought in this personal character piece, both in terms of Kirk dealing with his age and then also dealing with unfinished business with Kahn. Good God, the Nebula scene is still probably one of the best space to space, ship to ship, submarine to submarine.
Yeah, it's a submarine battle.
It is, definitely. And I mean, it's kind of ironic considering the last guy involved in one of these movies actually did direct a submarine movie. The whole thing just collectively works. It resonant emotionally, it's engaging from an action point of view. The set pieces are really good, the music's really good, the performances are really good. Ricardo Montalban is just wonderfully hammy as Kahn. And we finally got rid of all the beige uniforms. So definitely, this is absolute classic Star Trek movie.
From what I heard, the entire cast refused to do another movie wearing those uniforms. I think the only actor who didn't hate them was Nichelle Nichols, just because she wasn't in a miniskirt anymore. Mark, anything to say?
Oh, do I? This is the best Star Trek movie ever made.
He is lying.
Shut up. This is the single greatest Star Trek movie ever made. This is the high watermark. It doesn't get any better than this. This movie has pathos, gravitas. This has everything. This is an exploration of age, which really speaks to me now, considering as middle-aged. As a kid, I saw this movie around when it came out. I probably caught it when it was on like HBO. Dad is a huge Star Trek fan. It's one of the things we bonded over the years and don't fight about, believe it or not. So I saw this pretty close to when it came out. As a kid, I didn't get Kirk wrestling with his age, feeling like the Admiral shirt just didn't quite fit him, bristling up against the expectations of an Admiral with his desire to be out in the universe. That's not what spoke to me as a kid. What spoke to me as a kid was the match between Kahn and Kirk. This movie corrected all of the mistakes from the first one. You have a very visible villain in Kahn who has minions to do his bidding for him. You have the ship-to-ship battle, so it's not quite the zoomy dogfights of Star Wars, which were captured from the World War II movies. You have, as you guys put it, the submarine battle, and it's much more intellectual in that sense. Yeah, Ricardo Montalban as Kahn is super hammy, but I think when you're a kid, or when you're somebody who's like a casual movie goer, you want someone that leaps off the screen and captures your imagination. And the bicepy, muscly Ricardo Montalban as the Kahn does that for you. He's so good. And you have Kirk, who, as I said before, while it didn't resonate with me as a kid, as I watch it back now, it totally does. You have Kirk just chomping at the bit to want to captain that starship again, which is what he's going through in the first one and what he's going through in the fourth one. And it's like an ongoing thing with Kirk until he finally gets it back in 5, and what a disaster that was, but we'll get to it. Moving aside from our two main characters, you got a very fun thing with Spock in this movie. Spock is now ascended to leadership. He has a great line in this. He was like, "Take over the ship. I have no ego to bruise." I'm paraphrasing, but he steps out of the way for Kirk, and of course they have their exploration of friendship that is tested at the end, and this idea of the good of the many outweighing the needs of the few or the one. All that's in there. You have the dynamic between McCoy and Kirk, like why are we treating your birthday like a funeral, that sort of thing. There's all these great different action sequences that pepper the movie, that keep the action up, that keep the audience engaged. Kirstie Alley, she's playing a Vulcan, so it's not like she has a huge like dramatic role, but she's a fun character. She's our point of view character in this, which the movie desperately needed. Star Trek's a weird place, and if you're not like a huge fan of it, if you're just like the girlfriend going or the wife going with the boyfriend or the husband, you're gonna look at this and go, I don't understand what's happening here. You needed a Kirstie Alley character to kind of walk you along and show you what this world is all about. And I think she's a little underwritten, but I think purposely so, and it works. You can kind of put yourself in Kirstie Alley's position and go with the movie as just wild shit's happening left and right. The stuff with the Genesis device and Carol and Dave, and that's another like big relationship thing going on. I don't know why it resonated with me in this watch through most recently, but the conversation between Carol and Kirk, it's really emotional. She talks about, we weren't going to be a family, and I didn't want him in your world. I wanted him to be safe. I wanted him to be in mine. And Kirk's talking about reflecting on his life, where on the one hand, he's been a cowboy. He's been out there. He's been in the universe. He's been having fun. He's banging green broads. Who doesn't want that life, right? And then he says, and this is a brilliant line, there's a man who I haven't seen for 10 years who wants to kill me, and you show me a son that wants to help. And that broke my heart. It resonates with me now, I think, more as an adult than it did any other time I've watched this, and I've watched this quite a few. There's so much of that, though, in this movie. And that's why, like, you guys, like, oh, it's not the best, it's not the best. I can't think of another Star Trek movie that handles this many relationships with this much action. There's a lot of balls in the air in this movie, and not one of them drop. Performance-wise, action set pieces for not an action movie necessarily, for a sci-fi movie, themes, relationships, all of it, it's all there. It's perfect. I could spend the next hour gushing about this, but we'll be here all night if I do that. I defy you guys to come up with one thing, except for Robert. He's not allowed. I defy the rest of you to come up with one thing that's really wrong with this movie that sends it off its perfect mark, because I can't think of one being totally fair. It really is, for me, one of the most perfect movies ever made.
So with that challenge, Robert, you're up.
Okay, in all fairness, lest you all think I'm just trolling, when I say that this isn't the best Star Trek movie, the reality is that the best Star Trek movie is actually Galaxy Quest. Of the canonical Star Trek movies, it is really hard to find one better than this. I can find ones I prefer. That doesn't mean they're better. Mark's right when he says this juggles a lot of balls and does so mostly ably. I think if I'm going to nitpick, if there is one part of this movie that I feel is a little bit shortchanged, it feels like it was put in there to try and justify the relationship between Carol, David, and Kirk. And this is a gripe I have with Star Trek proper. Not just this movie, the entire IP. They don't ever actually know what Starfleet is. There's stuff about it that they try to pretend is taken from the military in terms of its structure, costuming, and hierarchies, but they eschew military conflicts, not in totality, but the vast majority of the time. They try to present it as purely exploratory. Not that there's no history of crossover between exploration and military outfits.
It's NASA with guns.
It's just like they never really get a feel for what Starfleet is. I bring that up here because a chunk of the gripe between Kirk and Carol is, I didn't want my son in your world. Well, again, depending on which version of Star Trek we're talking about, they're more scientists than military. It's not a terribly valid criticism. I mean, did you not see
I really
Star Trek, the
feel
motion
like
picture?
I don't want to cut you off, but I really feel like that is a super duper minute nitpick.
It is. I said if I wanted to be really nitpicky, this is the nitpick I would make. Did I not?
I'll be
Well,
good.
you're not going to bring up the fact that Chekhov wasn't actually in Space Seed, and thus there's no way Khan could ever remember his face.
Look.
I'm sorry. That's
you are entirely
shit
correct.
right there. That's unfair.
That's entirely correct. It's not a complaint I was going to make because I'm more forgiving of crap like that.
Oh, it's silly. It's CinemaSins.
It is, in the strictest of terms, a very valid complaint. But if there's something that I think gets shortchanged here, the discussion around science versus military obligation versus who's really at fault for something like this, it seems the kind of constant refrain you get in stuff like this is the scientists going, well, we created this doomsday weapon, but really it has these non-doomsday weapon applications, so is it really our fault when it gets turned into a doomsday weapon? To which the answer is, of course, yes, you morons. You carry a giant chunk of emotional and karmic culpability for your actions. I don't give a crap what your intentions were in this respect. Now, again, are you solely to blame? No. Whoever chooses to use it for those purposes carries the vast majority of moral weight. But you don't get to stick your head in the sand either and pretend that, well, we created this thing that will create life from anything. Oh, you say anything. Does that include our enemies? Wait, what? How did we get to genocide from Genesis? This doesn't make sense. Please put me back in my ivory tower so things make sense and I don't have to consider real-world consequences of my actions. If there's something in this movie that gets shortchanged, I think it's that discussion about, I didn't want him in your world. I wanted him here creating a device that perpetually ends all life. Because, me being a space cowboy, so much more dangerous than creating the Genesis device that turns a nebula into a brand new planet and consequently massively upends the entire political reality of the Federation and her allies. Yeah, good job.
Who knew splitting the atom would result in a huge bomb, really?
I'm actually more sympathetic to that argument just because there were people who thought the first time they did it that it would literally set the atmosphere on fire and end life on the planet.
And yet we did it anyway.
Who'd have thought, right? I think that gets a little bit shortchanged. The action sequences themselves are tremendous. Ricardo Montalban is hammy, but it's kind of in the way that you want this villain to be hammy. The relationship between Khan and his second in command, who is supposed to be his son, gets a little bit shortchanged, so his death never really carries the proper emotional weight.
Yeah, but do you really want to root for the villain's death?
I don't know, do you?
I don't think so. I think that's confusing for the audience.
I think Mark's right, but I do like that scene where he kind of tries to talk Khan off of it just because it shows how Ahab he's gone about Kirk.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes of the movie. Sir, you won. You don't have to pursue him. And Khan pulls a mate. He's like, but he asks me to. He asks me, and I must go to him. You could just see everybody else wants off that fucking ship at that point. Like, either Khan goes or they all go.
Know. They all know what's up at this point. They won't actually, mutiny, but they have another scene in the similar vein a little bit later, because that one's very restrained. It's one party presenting an argument. I don't know how necessary this is, sir. And he goes, well, it is because I'm a little bit crazy. And they go, well, you're the reason we're not on a blasted hellscape anymore, so okay, we'll go with you a little further. There's one scene a little bit later when they're, in the heat of nearly a battle, when Kirk is goading him into firing so they can figure out his position, and his ego just can't take it, and his son's like, no, he can't do anything to us. He's locked in, he's isolated on that floor, close down the elevator shafts, come back down, and you can tear the place apart looking for him, but I need him isolated and neutralized. I dipped into Die Hard there for a very deliberate reason.
And now I have a phaser. Ho, ho, ho.
Now I have the Genesis device. Then he's gone full Ahab. Never go full Ahab. It is a really, really wonderful movie. It is the proper movie to introduce anyone to the Star Wars franchise with, I tend to believe.
Star Trek.
Whatever. I'm going to screw that up all the time because I don't actually care enough about either property to...
Take pride in your podcast material, sir. I'm going to do this the next Damn You Hollywood. I'm going to call everything wrong.
How would that be different from...
God, fuck, you beat me to it.
Again, I do very much enjoy this movie. It is probably the best canonical Star Trek movie. It's not my favorite, but it's very, very hard to find any major complaints. It hits all the right notes. All the character interactions are on point. Mark touched on a few things that kind of break your heart about this movie. I think the one that gets me is McCoy actually trying to talk Spock out of going in there. Because those two have wildly divergent views on pretty much everything.
It's almost like they're used to externalize the conflicts in each episode.
Who'd have thought? Narrative devices.
Yeah. One person who's very logical and another person who's very emotional.
To be fair, though, if I want one of those two people to be logical, I'd rather be my physician than the science officer. But when he's like, no, I'm not going to let you do this. We might disagree, we might bicker, we might insult each other, but you are ultimately my friend and you're a part of this crew and I don't want to see you die horribly. That's dovetailed by, poor Scotty standing at the opening watching Spock and he's just constantly screaming at him to get out of there. There's a lot of emotional stuff here and it's to the credit of the show and all the actors, everyone involved, that they were able to pull it off the way they were. I say this isn't the best because I don't think it is, but I also say that to annoy Mark because it's very easy. And again, I only argue the point on shows like this where the entire point is to argue it. If you were to come up to me and say, this is the best Star Trek movie in casual conversation, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm also going to wonder why you think this is appropriate casual conversation for me, but that's a whole other story.
I'm gonna bring up two things really quick if I can.
Sure.
One, something fun. Would anyone like to find out about the movie we almost got?
Yes.
Reading from the Wikipedia entry, after the release of the motion picture, executive producer Gene Roddenberry wrote his own sequel. In his plot, the crew of the Enterprise traveled back in time to set right a corrupted timeline after the Klingons used the Guardian of Forever to prevent the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Boo!
Okay, there are certain people who are big picture creative types. I'll give Gene Roddenberry credit for that. That sounds so unbelievably dumb.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It would get made today to the detriment of everyone involved.
Dude, of course it would get made today. Look at what crap gets made today.
I think you're giving them too much credit, in all honesty.
Given the fact that Orchie and Kurtzman were involved in the Kelvin storyline, I'm kind of surprised they didn't do exactly that movie.
Give them time.
Look, now that some poor production assistant or some intern has heard our podcast, I'm sure that will be what J.J. Abrams thinks is a good idea next.
No,
Well, I don't
it's
think
going to
he's
be
doing any more Star Trek movies.
They're going to stretch that over Picard season 2.
That I
God,
wouldn't
I hope
put
not.
past them.
Oddly enough, that's closer in line with what Red Letter Media proposed for a potential storyline for Star Trek Picard.
They've like made an offer to Whoopi Goldberg to be back, so she could totally be a 70s hippie chick helping them. I mean, her race is basically immortal, right?
Yep.
Have her exist on Earth in the 70s, just looking much older than she does now, unless you want to splurge for the de-aging software.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean,
well,
she lived there in the 1870s, I think.
Okay, we haven't heard Andrew say that I'm completely right and that this is the best Star Trek movie ever.
I am not prepared to say that yet because we need to get all the way through the end because I have strong opinions about Star Trek 6. I need to ask a question for everybody. And I mean, I think, we talked about some of the potential shortcomings of this. And this kind of maybe leads us into the next movie. But does David Marcus work as a character? I feel like, and maybe I need to go back and rewatch both of these movies end to end, but it's like, he feels like he's put in there to give Kirk that conflict, but I don't know if this is an acting fault. I think it doesn't quite gel for me all the way.
So here's how I'm going to answer that question. I think he works as a character. I think he's a well-written character. I think the problem that you're wrestling with is that he's also a douchebag. He's somebody who was raised by his mama. He got the totally wrong impression of Kirk, and then he got thrown into a situation where his safe world, his little bubble that he grew up in, got completely popped, and suddenly he's having to deal with a lot. He's having to deal with a dad that showed up, his fellow scientist that got slaughtered, his life's work being stolen, and his life threatened.
Well,
so
I mean, that's a little bit of it, where he is kind of written as this intentional counterpoint to Kirk.
I think his character, if you're given a card with some notes on it for an actor to say, like, what's your motivations, what's your personality types, what are you supposed to be playing with this character? You know how they used to do with films where people used to act in them? He had to create a character here, and it couldn't just be his blonde afro. He had to... That's a terrible hairdo he's got. He's a douchebag.
That was intentional, by the way.
Oh, God. Well, okay. If they were going out of their way to, like, how can we make him even more douchey? How about blonde afro?
Well, they wanted
Make his hair look like Shatner's toupee.
Well, they wanted his hair to be curly like Shatner's toupee, and then blonde like the actress who played his mother.
Somebody really should have pulled the plug on that at the first screen test.
I don't think it seemed to have place given that what we just witnessed in the motion picture, it didn't bother me from a costuming point of view.
Okay,
Right.
so it benefits from good comparison. Fair enough.
So here's the deal, right? He's a douchebag, but his whole world gets turned upside down, so you're seeing him at his worst.
Oh, so it's Luke Skywalker.
So from a script perspective, yeah, he's a counterpoint to Kirk, but I think from a character perspective, you're seeing somebody who starts off all kinds of like messed up, and things only get worse, and then they have their moment at the end where he's like, oh, I get it now. So even this minor character has a bit of an arc to him that makes him interesting. I don't think he's a poorly written character. I just think that people's reaction to David is, you're a horrible douchebag to our hero Kirk.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they need to give him more time not in douchebag mode to balance that out a little bit, especially as he...
That's going to be the next movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but for how long? Ha, ha, ha.
He barely works across those two movies.
But he works.
He works like I work. Barely, and doing a really good job at convincing people you work better than you actually do.
You're so down on yourself. You're a lovely human being.
You've never paid me for work, trust me.
Okay.
This movie does a great job of juggling multiple elements in it. You have Kirk's dealing with getting older and wondering if he's still got the right stuff to captain the Enterprise, which he still wants to do. There's even a bit where Spock says, I think it was a mistake for you to accept promotion. Where you belong is in the chair on the bridge. So we have that aspect of Kirk. You have Khan being consumed by his quest for revenge that ultimately ends with him destroying everything he has gained from the start of the movie. Then we also have added on top of that the Kobayashi Maru no-win scenario plot point, where we find that Kirk cheated on a test that was designed to fail.
It goes to Kirk struggling with the concept of death, with the concept of getting old. Picture Kirk as kind of always seeing death in the rearview mirror and just running from it like Tom Cruise. So the Kobayashi Maru is an element of that. It's completely misunderstood by everyone currently involved in the IP. Kirk cheats because Kirk doesn't want to face death. This is Chekhov's gun, right? So he has to face death later when Spock sacrifices himself to save the ship. And just the glass between them is so symbolic. There's nothing Kirk can do. He can't cheat to get out of it. It's over. He's lost. Kirk never loses, but he lost. He lost the most important person in his life. And that's what people, I think, misunderstand about the Kobayashi Maru. You're not meant to see it. It's not meant to be this huge thing in Kirk's life. It's meant to be an example of he doesn't lose. And so when he does lose, it's that much more dramatically effective.
I love his line about it in this movie because Star Trek, the Abrams movie, botched the entire bit of, and I know they might have been doing some of it intentionally, but if you listen to what he says about it, he says, I reprogrammed the simulation so it was possible to rescue the ship. David starts laughing because he gets it, and poor Kirstie Alley's like, wait, what? David immediately goes, he cheated, but kind of gets lost in execution because everyone remembers him going, I don't believe in a no-win scenario, which is fine. That's a lot more of the character's thesis than it is the other thing he says. But he says he cheated, and Kirk just kind of blithely goes, I got a commendation for lateral thinking.
Thought it was original thinking, but
Whatever. Not only did he cheat, when caught, the response was, well, aren't you a clever boy? Like, why would he ever consider the alternative to this? It is a really nice bit of writing about his character that, yeah, I cheated. And when they caught me cheating, they rewarded me for thinking outside the box, because this is another part of his character. He's so unused to losing and so fundamentally rejects the notion that he will go to unbelievable lengths, including, as we're going to see in the next movie, commit treason on multiple levels to avoid it.
And on that segue, let's move on to Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Following Star Trek II, which was a huge success, they wanted to do another Star Trek, and they wanted to bring back Leonard Nimoy as a cameo. But Leonard Nimoy decided that, if I'm going to be in something Star Trek, I'd still like to be Spock. And in the exact reverse of what happened with the first film, where he had such a horrible time, he had such a great time working on the sequel that he said, yeah, I'm back in. So now you have to go from there being no Spock to there being a Spock again and explain all that. So there's our point for the third movie. We're going to search the heck for Spock.
David, I have a question. There's a scene in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn, where right before he goes into the warp core, he puts his fingers on McCoy's face and gives him a little pinch, a little squeal, and he goes, remember.
Yeah.
Did they know going into Star Trek II that they were going to kill the character but still want to give themselves an out in case Leonard Nimoy wanted to come back? Was that done purposefully?
I do not know for sure. I would assume that either it was something they spliced in at a later date, or it was just something they threw in there as a potential loophole to bring Spock back in the future if Leonard Nimoy wanted to come back. Or even maybe by that time in the production, Leonard Nimoy was like, I would be happy to do another one of these, so they threw that in there. But that's all speculation on my part.
So interestingly enough, when the kind of the version of Sci-Fi Up here, formerly called the Space Channel or Space Station, started here back in the mid 90s. One of the things that they had on heavy repeat was this kind of 1 hour, 1.5 hour interview documentary series dating from about 1982 with Leonard Nimoy, and he talked about his relationship with Spock, and it talked about the events of Wrath of Kahn, and for some level, I think there was a fair amount of unknown about whether or not he would come back. He sounded like he was fairly happy to bid the character goodbye, but obviously what they had brought forward in terms of character and story, and I think some of his own personal ambiguity around the character.
You can just say money.
Yeah, money too. It seems like there was maybe a legitimate desire there for him to leave the character, but since that point, he seems to have resolved with it to go forward and get a nice paycheck on the way to Star Trek 3.
Thanks, Andrew. So, following the events of Star Trek II, the Enterprise returns to space dock and McCoy starts acting strange. Kirk talks with Sarek, Spock's father, who asks him if they saved Spock's Katra, which is his mind or his soul. Kirk realizes that it is probably in McCoy. If they take Spock's body back to Vulcan, they can return Spock's mind into his body. Unfortunately, they left Spock's body on the newly formed Genesis planet. Kirk asks the Admiralty for permission to return to the Genesis planet, but is denied due to the new political tensions surrounding the use of the Genesis device. Kirk and the crew decide to go anyway, stealing the Enterprise. Starfleet sends the new USS Excelsior to stop the Enterprise, but Scotty puts space sugar in the Excelsior's space gas tank.
I am totally stealing that if I ever have to talk about this movie again.
So the Enterprise with its skeleton crew get to the Genesis planet, and as they're doing their best to find Spock, oh no, a Klingon bird of prey captained by Christopher Lloyd with First Officer John Larroquette decloaks. He wants to get the Genesis device to use it as a weapon so that he can rule the galaxy or be promoted in the Klingon Empire.
At the very least, he can get 1.21 gigawatts out of it so he can get his DeLorean working again.
Yeah, but how's he going to get to Warp 88 without turning into a space salamander?
Look, I only have one thing to say to you all.
God, don't bring up that episode of Voyager.
Give me Genesis! Give it to me! Give me Genesis! Give it!
If we're going to talk about terrible lines from this movie, I would see your give me Genesis and raise you an I kick, have had kick, enough kick of you kick.
What, he was just
So
using the
good.
Shatnerian comma.
They outgun us 6-1.
They weren't really anticipating having to fight a Klingon warship, even as small as a bird of prey. Christopher Lloyd has captured Saavik and David, who were there to investigate the Genesis planet. He demands Kirk surrender the Enterprise and kills David to show how serious he is. So Kirk surrenders, he beams all of his crew down to the surface, the Klingons beam over, and oh snap, he set the self-destruct, the ship goes boom, and then that's pretty much the end of the action for this movie. Then they faff around a bit, Kirk fights with Christopher Lloyd, Kirk wins, Kirk takes over the bird of prey, the Genesis planet shakes itself apart because they used some shortcut proto-matter to make it work. Now it's not working anymore. They escape on the bird of prey, go to Vulcan, Spock's brain is put back inside Spock. Again, everyone's happy. The end. And Robert, you want to get us started?
This movie reads a little bit like Rocky 2, which is to say we had an unexpected hit on our hands the first time, and people liked 90% of it. But boy, wouldn't it have been nice if Rocky won? Here, we loved the movie, but boy, we didn't like the bummer of Spock dying. Couldn't we have a do-over? So we get a do-over. The dialogue isn't as good. The themes and motifs aren't as good. You do get a little bit of continuity when it comes to Kirk. I still don't believe in the no-win scenario. I spend all my life running away from and laughing at death. And he got my best friend, but now I'm going to have the last laugh because Vulcan space magic, which is not the dumbest idea that's ever been put forth by Star Trek. You have Christopher Lloyd doing a good job to the extent that he's given anything to do. Lloyd's a fantastic character actor, but it suffers from coming on the heels of a vastly superior movie. It suffers from a lot of its own shortcomings even regardless of that.
Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, should have been called Star Trek 3, More Dinosaurs. They looked at everything that was right about Star Trek 2 and was like, more of that shit. But it's not a good movie. No. People liked it. Just do more of it. And that's how Star Trek 3 became a thing.
Yeah, there is some good stuff here. The shot of the Enterprise streaking like a flaming comet across the sky after being blown up is a really good shot, if nothing else.
Sure.
It's an incredibly limited movie. It reeks of, like you said, more dinosaurs. I think ultimately that's kind of where it fails. And it also sets up, not my straight up least favorite Star Trek movie, but up there. Because I really do not enjoy The Voyage Home. So I tend to look a little bit dimly on this movie for directly setting that up. There's so much about this movie that winds up a little bit slipshod in terms of storytelling. They could have done so much more with the character of Bones going a little bit crazy, and instead it's played more for not even good laughs most of the time.
Then there's, of course, second-rate Kirstie Alley.
Yeah, there's the David character here. I mean, I still don't like him. He's moderately more tolerable because he's not just being a giant asshat, but he's still not really anything more than a device to give Kirk something to react to most of the time. And I can say that with a fair degree of confidence because one movie removed from this movie, he's never mentioned again, which ought to tell you how much importance anyone placed on that character about anything. The entire fight scene between Kirk and Christopher Lloyd on the breaking up planet looks hokey and not in the endearing way. I think it's kind of my last thing there. It's just not all that interesting a film.
Andrew, you want to take over?
I'm going to quote Mark. It's fine.
Oh,
That's about all I got to say about it. I mean, it's there. It functions well enough. Speaking of that final fight, if I remember right, that also used one of the really bad 80s falling down a chasm, and the person is like rotating in a way that is just truly unnatural.
you would be correct. That is part of that fight scene.
I consider probably the most affecting part of that movie is probably the destruction of the Enterprise. No bloody A, B, C, or D. That is a pretty fantastic shot of the self-destruct going off, and then I think obviously the crew's reaction to it, which, okay, this kind of brings up a perfectly logical question to ask, but it's like, he lost his ship, he lost his son, he got Spock back, and it doesn't seem to be quite a fair deal for Kirk on this, so there's maybe some essential logic to the movie that's missing a little bit, but yeah, it's kind of there. It's decent enough. It kind of wraps up the middle chapter of the Spock trilogy, and it just does what it does.
And Mark?
Andrew's absolutely right. It's the middle chapter of the Spock trilogy. which ends nicely and lovely with the Voyage Home. Let me do a miniature on trial here for Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock, because the major criticism of it is it amps up the action. It takes all of the things about Star Trek 2 and just more of it. So they can't just blow up the Enterprise and really batter it around. They have to blow it up, which you guys have already talked about. It's a really cool shot. But it's in the movie because, like, well, people seem to really like it, so let's keep destroying the Enterprise. They tried to bring back Kirstie Alley. She doesn't come back and said they got the understudy. And she's not really a great actress, and she's not effective as that character. She's kind of a nag. The problem with David from the second one to the third one is in the second one, he goes on a journey emotionally to where he comes to accept his father. And then after that, he's no longer interesting. And then and you're not given a reason to cheer David on. Like, the problem with all of these movies is that they gave Kirk so much. He's the hero in all of them with his little band of travelers. As an audience member, you're there for Kirk, you're there for Spock, you're there for McCoy. You're not there for David. David served his purpose in 2 and probably shouldn't have been in the third one, but because they're dealing with Genesis, they kind of needed him there, or they needed to write a reason why he wasn't there and somebody else was. Either way, his sacrifice in the movie doesn't add up to much because you're not given a reason to cheer for David. He went from being an interesting character who goes on a journey to a nothing character who goes nowhere and then dies in, like, the least heroic way possible.
Yeah, I think it just serves to up the stakes.
Yeah.
Like, wow, they really will kill people.
Right. They killed a character that the audience doesn't relate to. Terrific. In defense of this movie, though, Christopher Lloyd is so funny. I don't know if he knows he's acting badly, or if they were like, we need you to be more like Khan. And he's like, what, just yell at the camera? Yes. Okay. So he gets some of the stupidest dialogue, and it sounds hilarious when he's yelling it. Give me Genesis! It's hysterical, and I laughed every time I watched it. And he has another couple of great ones. Like, somebody says something to him on the ship, he's like, and he just points a gun at him and goes, give me a reason, Cog. They gave Christopher Lloyd so many funny lines to just yell at, and Christopher Lloyd has to know this isn't a good movie. But he signed on, and he did his professional best. So here's the thing with Star Trek 3. It's a stupid movie, but it's made for, like, casual movie-going fans that came on board with Star Trek 2. Like, there's a section of the audience in the mid-'80s who did not watch TOS, did not see the motion picture, and went with their husband or boyfriend to see Wrath of Kahn. And so when their husband or boyfriend wanted to see the second one, they were like, oh, is that the one where Spock dies at the end? Yeah, okay, that's fun. And so this is written for, like, the most casual of casual people going to the movies to experience a fun Star Trek romp, which is the direction they took the entire franchise after Star Trek 2. So with that said, it doesn't even work as sci-fi. It works as, like, an action-adventure in space. But it works as an action-adventure in space where the actors are trying their level best to elevate a terrible screenplay. And it mostly works as one of those turn your brain off and go for the ride kind of movies. It doesn't work if you're looking for Star Trek, science fiction, or a good movie. It just kind of works as a fun experience. And that's Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock.
Yeah, I would say Star Trek 3 is probably the okayest of the Star Trek movies. Like, it's not great, it's not terrible, it's kind of just there.
It's a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Yeah, you know what this is? This is the movie you really wish were the worst Star Trek movie.
Yeah,
that's totally fair.
The bar has been lowered so much.
I wish this were the worst. I genuinely do, because it's not great. It's a decent enough turn your brain off kind of movie. And if this had been the absolute worst this franchise ever got, I think we could all toast to this movie in that respect.
What I like to say is it's a franchise maintenance movie. It's just there to change up something in the franchise. We got Spock back. That's the movie. That's the whole point of the film.
It's Captain Marvel, if we're like making MCU comparisons. It exists.
Yeah,
it keeps the machinery turning. Nothing interesting actually happens.
The most interesting thing outside of the heist of the Enterprise and the crippling of the Excelsior is I do believe this is our introduction to the Klingon bird of prey. I'm a big starship guy, so like whenever I get to see these ships.
The bird of prey is a really cool design.
Oh, it's so good. I would also like to say this marks the third occasion in 3 movies where there has been a shakedown or training cruise that has gone wrong for a ship.
Yeah, they got into a rut with the Kirk movies that they could not get themselves out of because they do the same gags in 2, 3, 5, and 6. It's ridiculous.
I would say once the Enterprise blows up and you get the Scotty, what have I done? But that's pretty much the bulk of the interesting parts of this film. Then you can just skip forward to Kirk kicking Christopher Lloyd off a cliff and, yeah, roll credits.
I've had enough of you!
Yeah, you've pretty much gotten everything
Mark,
that there is of any value out of this film.
You have no idea how much I occasionally empathize with that sentiment when we review movies.
It's written into my will that on my last day on Earth, Robert Winfree has to yell, "I've had enough of you," and kick me into an open grave.
For the record, I'd also like to say that Christopher Lloyd is the second hammiest actor in this entire series to play a Klingon while being named Chris.
I am vaguely offended on behalf of Christopher Plummer for that dig.
Oh, no. I love General Chang. I love that entire performance. Trust me, that was more complimentary than anything else.
Where he manages to be a Klingon without the actual Klingon prosthetic makeup because he just looked at it and gave it the middle finger.
He is an all-time Hall of Fame Klingon, though, him and Martok.
Okay.
I think that kind of wraps us up on Star Trek 3, which we have talked more about than anyone should ever talk about Star Trek 3.
That's not true. We're about to spend a lot of time talking about a worse movie.
Well, with that brilliant segue, let's go into Star Trek 4. So at this point, Leonard Nimoy is in charge, and he's kind of decided that he wants to do something a bit lighter than the past two films, something a bit more jovial and somewhat less high stakes. And he also kind of wants to throw in an environmental message. So, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. An alien space probe comes to Earth. And
stop me if you've heard this before.
Yeah. and any attempts to stop it result in the ships or defense systems being shut down. So the probe gets to Earth, starts turning off everything and raising the oceans up. It's mass hysteria, dogs sleeping with cats. What are we going to do? Around this time, Kirk and the USS Bounty, the reclaimed bird of prey.
That is the only good gag in this entire movie for me. The fact that they renamed the bird of prey the Bounty.
So Kirk and company are on their way back to Earth to face the consequences of their actions. And then, oh no, it's all gone to hell. So Spock figures out that this probe is transmitting in humpback whale music. And he figures that this probe must have visited Earth before humans were the dominant form of life and managed to communicate with the humpback whales who are intelligent enough to talk to it. And now it is looking for the humpback whales, but oh darn, us pesky stupid modern day humans, we drove them to extinction, so we are fresh out of humpback whales.
As I reflect on this movie, the more I think that whatever brain-dead jackass made Blackfish just saw this movie while high and went, dude.
That would have been more fun if they actually went with Gene Roddenberry's plan of having like half the Enterprise D being underwater so marine life could also be on the ship. Could you just imagine if they had like a crew member that was a killer whale?
I can, because I've watched BoJack Horseman.
Moving onward, so one thing that is not an issue is time travel, where they figured out from a previous episode that if they go around the sun at warp speed in reverse orbital direction, it'll take them back in time. So they go back in time to when the movie was filmed, to San Francisco to go and find them some whales. The ship is now broken and they need to fix it, so Chekhov goes off to do that. Kirk goes to find some humpback whales, and Scotty goes to figure out a way that they can carry the whales around in their ship without them dying. They fix the ship, they get the whales. Kirk hooks up with a marine biologist who has nothing to live for in the present, goes into the future with the whales. The whales talk to the probe is happy, it runs off, and the world is saved. And in light of them saving the world, again, the Federation decides to punish Kirk by demoting him to captain and giving him back the newly renamed USS Yorktown as the Enterprise NCC 1071A. So Kirk's punishment is to get exactly what he wanted in the first place. And every time I look at that Federation Council, realizing that apparently just 3 of those people threatening to leave the Federation because of helping the Romulans sounds even more dumb.
Boy, doesn't it?
Mark, you want to go first?
Yeah, this is a lovely movie. It's fun for the whole family. I love the fact that it's like a light comedic take on Star Trek. You know, the discussion that we've had so far. You've had the first movie, which is pure classic sci-fi, which bored people to tears. Then you have the best one that's just hearty with all this emotional gravitas. Then you have the third one, which is a fun action space movie. So yeah, why not do a comedy next? Why not do a comedy, I always say. And so, you know, you've got this mainstream audience. Star Trek's never looked better than it does right now. This is what you need to do to get the most ticket sales you can possibly have. Have some fun in space. I have fun with this movie. This is the very first Star Trek movie I ever showed my 9-year-old daughter because I knew she would relate to the marine biologist character, and also because it's so light on science fiction and so high on comedy that if you're gonna spoon feed somebody Star Trek who isn't already like a sci-fi fan, I think this is actually the most palatable of all the movies. So there was a method to my madness. This has got some great gags in it. The punk rocker on the bus, just the exploration of colorful language, something I'm very fond of.
All double of that. Dumbass to you too.
Thank
Damn,
you.
you beat me to it, Dave.
There's some great bits with the marine biologist, Kirk and Spock, where he's just talking about Gracie being pregnant and why in the Vulcan mind meld with the whale and all of that. And at one point she says something to Spock, and Spock's like, the hell I did. So good. If you kind of turn your brain off and just have fun with this, there's a lot of fun to be had. There's a lot of really funny lines. Chekhov doing slapstick comedy on the... What do you think of him? Well, he's a Rusky. I know he's a Rusky, you dumbass. But he's like a retard or something. Oh, the 80th. I miss you. Chekhov...
No one ever.
Chekhov running off the deck. Just the exchange between Chekhov and the naval officers is hilarious. The stranger in a strange land, people out of time element of the crew trying to figure out the 80s. The bit where they first get to San Francisco and they go to trade in the glasses to get money so they can ride buses and stuff and just get around. And they're all just kind of standing there in the corner waiting for Kirk. Boy, is that a metaphor for the Star Trek movies? The rest of the crew just standing there waiting for Kirk to tell them to do something. And he's like, mingle a little bit, move around. You look like a cadet. All that stuff cracks me up. If you like your Star Trek serious, if you like your Star Trek more of the First Contact variety, action, suspense, science fantasy, Picard with a machine gun shooting Borg, this is not going to be your movie. But if you allow yourself to have fun with it and have fun with sort of the 80s comedic vibe that it's giving off, and you can accept the overbearing environmental message of stop killing animals into extinction, it's a fun movie. It's a fun time to be had by all. It's utterly inoffensive, and it wraps up the Spock trilogy rather nicely. Because what else did you want them to do? Fight Klingons again? Fight the other 80 million other species that they could have had a run-in with? No. Let them run around San Francisco for 2 hours. It's fine. It's fine. Andrew Graham knows what I'm talking about.
You know what, Mark? I do know what you're talking about. Yeah, this is a really fun movie. This is like a nice palate cleanser in the middle of the Star Trek movies. It's kind of and I'm not being reductive when I say this. This is the Ant-Man of the Star Trek movies. It's something where you can just really sit there, enjoy it. And I really enjoy Ant-Man a lot, and I kind of treat it the same way. It's definitely a little outside of the...
I will agree with you just because Mark and I spent 90 minutes yelling at each other over that movie when I said it's a giant nothing.
I enjoy the hell out of Ant-Man.
We yelled at each other over Ant-Man and the Wasp. We never...
Oh, that's right. That's right. It was the sequel. They're so similar, I sometimes forget they're different movies.
But yeah, I mean, it works really well. All the characters get to have some fun with it. Whenever I have a computer problem, there's only one thing I say, and that is, hello, computer, in my best James Doohan. So
now I hope you hear me saying to you, just use the keyboard.
Definitely. But yeah, I mean,
you have to use your hands. It's like a baby's toy.
Hey, save the Back to the Future jokes for the last movie.
Nah, anywhere I can shoehorn them in.
Great, Scott. Anyway, that's Star Trek 4. I mean, it definitely is a little heavy-handed with the conservation messages, although I don't think humpbacks are endangered anymore, so maybe it worked. Or, I don't know, maybe just all the fishermen had the thought of a Klingon bird of prey appearing over you, and instead they decided to change their jobs instead.
No, it totally worked. Just as Rocky IV ended the Cold War, Star Trek 4 saved the planet.
I like that one. Mark, since you mentioned the true hero of this movie, the punk rocker, I have looked up the man, and he was actually a sound editor on the movie.
Nice. By the way, I don't know what song that is they're playing. They might probably made it up for the movie, but I still sing it. I still will sing it around the house. Like, I hate you and I berate you. As somebody who is a student of punk rock and a music reviewer, that song is hilarious to me. That's like when you were in class and your friend would just make up a punk rock song. Kill your mother, kill your father, run your sister over with a blazer, that sort of thing. That song is totally what a junior high kid makes up when he thinks of punk rock. It's hilarious.
The gentleman's name is Mark Mangini. He actually wrote it. There's actually a secondary connection there because on the back of my blazer, I have a sticker from Mad Max Fury Road. And Mr. Mangini won the Academy Award in 2015 for sound editing on that movie. So witness me. Mark Mangini, good for you.
Good on you.
All right. Yeah.
Great. Well done for that
movie. He finally got to work on a good movie.
Oh, shut up.
Anyway, that's about my thought. It's really good. It's really fun. Like Mark said, I mean, this would be definitely something that this is a Star Trek movie you can show basically anybody, and it balances the cast really well.
And Robert, get him, Winfrey.
You've heard from Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Here's reality. This is an unbelievably bland, almost impossibly stupid, self-aggrandizing entry into this franchise, which
Are you
is
sure
not
we're not talking about Star Trek 5?
Which is not at all unused to those particular adjectives being attached to it. The comedy is like all comedy. It's going to be very, very hit and miss depending on who you are. Much of it is the same, is my big gripe with so much of this movie. It's the same stupid jokes. It's the same stupid situations. It's the same stupid setups. You can watch 5 minutes of this movie, any 5 minutes, and I guarantee you can get everything about the entire plot from that 5 minutes. I would agree that this does a slightly better job of balancing what other cast members do throughout the course of this movie. I don't know what possible in-world excuse they came up with for sending Chekhov to infiltrate the military installation.
Well, in their defense, A, they had a transporter, and B, this is so removed from where they are that the thought of war between Russia and the United States would be the last thing to think of.
I don't care. If I am sent back in time and I have to... Look, what would roughly be equivalent if we go back a few thousand years in human history?
I think it'd be more like 300 years.
I would say why don't you go back to the Roman Empire?
I'm not sending the Gallic crew member to infiltrate Rome.
In their defense, this was kind of a rush job.
I am not sending the... I'm
Hebrew.
not sending the Hun to infiltrate Constantinople. The Mongols do not get to go in to southern China. I'm sorry, I have a cursory knowledge of history slightly deeper than that, but deep enough to know the Cold War being the giant shaping mechanism through the history of the planet that it was. How about we just not send this one particular guy, but the comedic potential just circumvents all possible logic. Bite me.
And if I remember right, like it's Chekhov's biography that he is actually from the USSR and not from Russia, because when they wrote him, they didn't know that the Cold War had ended yet.
I know. I know. It's so stupid. The closest thing this movie gets to a laugh out of me is DeForest Kelley going through a hospital.
That was great.
Dark Ages?
And he sees this poor woman on dialysis. What's wrong with you? Dialysis treatment. And his response is, dialysis, the way one of us might say, the plague?
Or leeches.
Yeah.
What is this, the Dark Ages? And then they pass her again, and she's completely normal. He's restored her.
I got a new kidney. Doctor gave me some pills, and I got a new kidney.
Yeah, DeForest Kelley appropriately reacting to those the way a contemporary surgeon transported back to the Dark Age. Like, so what's your plan of treatment here? Well, we're going to apply leeches. I'm recommending a course of mercury. And if all else fails, we're going to amputate. Really what it is his brain. His brain needs more air. We're going to crack open his skull, let it breathe a little bit. I'm sure that'll help.
His humors are out of alignment.
Yeah. That's the closest thing this gets to a laugh out of me in that respect. It's just an unbelievable nothing movie for so much of it. It's ham-fisted in its messaging. Even for a Star Trek movie, this is ham-fisted.
How much of this is you just not liking this particular kind of comedy, and how much of this is the movie's not written well?
I think it's about 50-50. I suppose my counter-argument to that would be, when this style of comedy is so much of this movie, does it really matter? Like, take an Adam Sandler movie, probably not written well, but the comedy's also terrible. So which of those am I really going to hold it accountable for? I understand the desire to go in a different direction. I can understand it logically. This is not an interesting movie. This is the closest this franchise gets to stoner comedy. This is for the people who go in high as a kite.
Hang on, Robert. Lower Decks hasn't come out yet. There's like a 1-minute gag of opening and closing a blast shield.
Which would not have been out of place in this movie. I'm genuinely shocked that at least 2 of the crew members didn't get stuck in a revolving door.
I'd have laughed.
I know you would have, Mark. I'll say this. I can understand that objectively this is better than Search for Spock in most ways. I really dislike this movie. I am bored by it. I am not amused. I will skip it every time at every opportunity.
My 9-year-old girl daughter likes it.
I rest my case.
Yep.
Star Trek 4, I find, on paper, it sounds like the worst idea for a Star Trek movie. Like, crew of the Enterprise have to travel back in time to rescue humpback whales to save future Earth from being destroyed by an alien space probe. This sounds like someone trying to write a bad Star Trek script intentionally.
Yeah, if they had thrown in sex between Spock and Kirk, they'd have had slash fiction.
That exists.
I view it as the highest of praise to just the actors and the direction in this film that somehow, despite that premise, they pulled it off. Like, I know, Robert, it didn't work for you, but I just found the whole seeing this crew from the future existing in what was then modern San Francisco, and just how it just seemed so natural, the things that confused them or that they didn't understand or the faux pas they made.
What does exact change mean?
Exactly. Like, it's not so funny Chekhov being interrogated by the Navy. It's Chekhov walking up to random people on the street. Excuse me, sir. Can you tell me which direction the nuclear vessels are?
I'm trying to find Almeida, where the nuclear vessels are. The nuclear vessels in Almeida.
This is like the worst Russian spy in history. It just works the way that the extras react to the main cast members.
I almost, in all seriousness, I almost wonder if those weren't just random people on the street that actor was going up and accosting.
I do believe those were actually extras. I remember there was one interaction where the extra actually responded, and extras aren't supposed to talk because they have to pay them more money.
Yeah.
But they said, you know what, that scene worked so well, we'll pay her to keep it in.
Aw.
Even just like Chekhov being interrogated in the carrier, it's like, okay, how do I get out of this without explaining to them that I'm from the future? Because that's just going to sound crazy. Scotty with the computer. Kirk and Spock probably had the least interesting story in actually just getting the whales. Most of the humor there is them learning how to take public transit.
A lot of the humor, if the marine biologist isn't working as a character, then the whole movie kind of falls apart. Because the central part of the movie is Kirk and Spock trying to get the whales, and that means interacting with her. She, fortunately for the movie, doesn't come across nearly as shrill, and this is the actress I'm talking about. She doesn't come across as shrill or naggy or a pain in the ass as I think she's written. The actress actually has a lot of, like, charisma. Her and Kirk on the date, and they're all flirty with each other and eating pizza, and she's, on the one hand, Kirk doesn't seem like a weirdo. His story seems odd. His story seems like a homeless person story, but he has a lot of charisma. That's like one of my favorite scenes of the movie, reflecting on it as an adult, is her and him on a date. And he's like, tell me your real story. And Kirk knows he sounds like a lunatic. He's like, you want the truth out of me? And he's struggling with it. And she wants to believe him, but his story sounds so stupid. She's like, okay. But what's hilarious about her character is that she's been on worse dates. So
that I have no problem believing.
That's why that whole scene works. She thinks he's a lunatic, but this isn't the worst lunatic she's ever come across. The subtext of that scene is hilarious, especially if you've been on a date like that where you're talking to the person and you're like, I want to bang you. You seem like a lunatic, but somehow or other that isn't scaring me off.
Oddly enough, one of the best lines out of that entire scene, I actually had to show up on my Facebook feed today. I'm part of a couple different Star Trek groups, and one guy, he lives very close to, I think it's Riverside, and he was proudly wearing the I was born in Iowa, but I work in space t-shirt.
You'd also think the marine biologist would have enough sense to tell them you can't actually recreate a species with only 2 members. There's not enough genetic diversity to sustain it over the long haul, but hey, sure.
Well, they needed the whales to talk to the probe. That was the main
At which
thing.
point they could be cut up and sold as delicacies.
Yeah. I mean, I would assume that we have the technology to clone the whales and introduce enough artificial genetic diversity to repopulate the species should they desire to. Actually, they probably would already have that technology anyway. It's like Jurassic Park, except with the DNA intact. But
then
anyway.
Why did they have to go back in time in the first place?
Oh my God.
Actors are not scientists.
Okay, no, we're not going down this, because then we're going to start talking about Julian Bashir and all the things around Khan, and it's just not going to go well.
This isn't a movie where you get down in the weeds. Like, why did they need transparent aluminum? Why couldn't you just use aluminum? You don't actually need to see inside the tanks for the whales to be in them.
I'm gonna bite my computer screen. Please move on.
The lithium actually doesn't store antimatter. It's just was a convenient plot device used. You'd need like an actual magnetic containment system with a vacuum in it.
True. Siphoning of random radiation from across multiple layers of heavy metals in a nuclear facility. Just no.
Right, exactly.
You two make me want to kill myself. I swear to God. You know what's worse than one Mr. Wizard on a podcast? 2 of y'all.
So, Mark, why don't you and I start discussing why God needs a starship?
Yes.
Star Trek IV saved against all odds by good performances and acting, which will be completely upturned in the next film. Though oddly enough, I think Star Trek IV actually is, adjusted for inflation, the highest grossing Star Trek movie.
Ah, motherfuckers.
Well, sure, it's the dumbest.
You say dumb, I say successful.
Those two are far from mutually exclusive. I'm not arguing the success.
But speaking of stupid, hackneyed, egotistical, terrible acting and direction, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. and almost the final film. So after Leonard Nimoy got to direct one film, William Shatner, who has up to this point been counting lines in each script to make sure no one gets more than he does, said, hey, what about my film? So he finally got the reins to make his own Star Trek movie, and he makes Star Trek V, Captain Kirk is to awesome love Will.
One does have to wonder if he didn't look at Star Trek 3 and go, you know what, this is a trash fire, I'm going to make a bigger one.
I would assume that everyone involved with the Kelvin timeline, with the exception of Beyond, probably mails William Shatner a basket of edible arrangements every month as thank you for making sure that their work is not the worst films that have ever been made in the history of Star Trek.
Oh, no, we can have that discussion about Into Darkness later.
So, Star Trek V. Captain Kirk is climbing a mountain. Why is he climbing a mountain?
Because it's there.
Nobody has a coherent answer to that question, even though William Shatner tried.
No one has a coherent answer for why anyone contemporarily climbs a mountain. They do it because they're crazy.
Kirk's climbing a mountain with Spock and McCoy in tow. They get called up to go help out on this planet where there's a local disturbance going on. They beam up to the newly recommissioned Enterprise, which Scotty is busy fixing up. So they end up going to this new planet to rescue the diplomats that are apparently being held hostage there, only to find out that the diplomats are actually in on it, and they're all part of a cult led by Spock's half-brother, because adding extra siblings to Spock always seems to be a good idea for some reason.
So, is his father the biggest hypocrite, or is his mother just a whore? Have we ever established this?
I think it might have
Mom's
been
a whore.
previous marriage or something. Anyway, Spock has a half-brother who believes that God, or whatever most species put in the place of God, is at the center of the galaxy, which has some sort of impenetrable barrier that he thinks the Enterprise can get across for some reason.
Because it's the Enterprise.
Fair enough.
Look, this is a man with some degree of self-awareness. He sees the fourth wall, and he knows if he's on the plot armor ship, he can break it.
I'm going to go with that. That sounds like a better explanation than anything in the actual film. So he has this technique where he mind melds with you and removes your pain, and that turns everyone into his willing servant, who everyone goes along with this crazy idea, except for Kirk, because Kirk is the awesome, and everyone in the film must turn against him so he can single-handedly save the universe despite having his entire crew turned against him, except for Spock and McCoy, because both Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley had the clout to say, we're not going to do this, we're walking off unless you fix this. They get to the center of the universe, galaxy, sorry. Apparently my understanding of astromechanics is only slightly better than the writers of modern Trek. They go there, they find this planet, everyone beams down, they find this freaky alien floating around that turns out, oh no, it's not God, it's the devil. Kirk asks it, why does it need a starship? It needs the starship to cross the barrier so it can spread evil across the universe. Cybok goes, oh no, I've made a horrible mistake. He fights with the demon alien thing. The bird of prey that has been secretly tailing the Enterprise up till now has been pressed into service on the good guy side by the Klingon ambassador that they picked up. Goes in, blows up Cybok and the evil alien. Everyone has a nice reception afterwards. The end. Robert, you want to go first?
I can't even get angry at this movie. This movie is just so irredeemably bad, I can't get mad at it. It's that pathetic little, I can't hit this poor dog anymore, you know? It's so bad. Everywhere. On every level. The performances are all they're either phoned in or ridiculously over the top.
Special shout out to Walter Koenig and George Takei for that amazing performance that was so phoned in I thought they were being sarcastic.
I'm getting lost in the woods.
The entire narrative, such as it exists for this movie, doesn't actually conclude in anything approximating a satisfactory manner. Hey, let's all get to this one place where we think God exists. And then we get there and 5 different people have to ask what does God need a starship for and get zapped for it. Then Spock's brother wrestles with it. Special effects go off. We all leave. I puke the end. There is nothing of note here. There is nothing good here. This is a comically bad movie. And when I said I wished Star Trek 3 were the worst, believe it or not, I wish this were the worst. Because while this is not laudably bad, the fact that it goes down from here in any sort of way is just tragic beyond belief.
Andrew, anything to say?
This one was kind of funny because I watched, like I said, as part of my rewatch, I basically only watched this one, or I only got through about a third of this one, and the motion picture, and I'm going to go with a hot take, and I'm not saying this movie is good by any stretch. Everything Robert said is pretty valid. I mean, I kind of like a couple of the beginning scenes around Yellowstone.
They're not in Yellowstone. They're in Yosemite.
Yosemite, sorry.
There's entirely too many national parks in this country. I don't blame anyone for getting him confused.
I kind of like a couple of the parts in Yosemite, but this movie is dumb as a post. That also said, looking at the breadth of Star Trek movies, if you were to put a gun to my head, I would watch this before the motion picture.
Mm.
And I would definitely watch this before Into Darkness, which is a movie so offensively stupid that it hurts.
Into Darkness is one of those rare movies like Rise of Skywalker that actively tries to insult your intelligence.
Okay, let me jump in here. If I have a choice between the motion picture Into Darkness or Star Trek V,
You choose another round of chemo?
Yeah, but
one of those will actually end up having a possibility of saving your life.
I would do this differently. Fuck, marry, kill. Here's what we're gonna do.
The answer in all three cases is going to be William Shatner.
No, fuck, marry, kill, Star Trek V, Into Darkness, and the motion picture. So totally fuck Into Darkness. It's a romping good time if you don't think about it or care about Star Trek. If you're just looking for a punch-me-in-the-face action, everybody is running and yelling, and it's rock stupid, and it's the kind of movie you can put on when you're flipping through the channels, and you're waiting for wrestling to start, or you're waiting for boxing to start, and you're like, I just need to kill like an hour of my time before this other thing I really want to watch comes on. And it's one of those movies where you can just sort of put it on, and it's like, okay, rock my world. You did great, and then immediately forget about it. This is a hit it and quit it kind of movie.
So it's a great movie if you're Alex Kurtzman.
Right. Marry the motion picture, because you should always marry at least something that attempts to be a good, proper film project. You absolutely kill Star Trek V. It has no redeemable qualities. Hey, let's do a space movie, okay? Let's set the whole thing on a desert. Wait, what? Let's do a space movie. Let's get some in-shape, hot actor. Everyone's fat and out of shape. All right? Let's have a space romp. Let's have an action good time. Let's start out camping in a national forest. Fuck me running. Let's call it the final frontier, and let's find God at the end of the universe. It's a space wizard. Damn it! Damn you, Star Trek V. You fail at everything.
I'm not sure to respond to half of that, but I mean, I will say credit where credit's due. Lawrence Luckenbill is kind of fun as Sybok, as batshit crazy as that character is written.
Can I tell you something about Sybok? The one good thing I can take from Star Trek V was around the time this came out, one of my friends was in a band, and they wrote a song called I Couldn't Help But Notice Your Pain, and they just kept sampling that.
That's fantastic.
We also used to play D&D, and one of my friends had a character who, before he would kill people, he'd go, I couldn't help but notice your pain, share it with me, and then just would wipe somebody out.
Can this replace the I'm the author of all your pain, James? It's hot garbage, but I can at least live with it a lot more, kind of the pretension of the motion picture or the pants on head stupid of Into Darkness. I hate Into Darkness more than I hate frigging Revenge of the Fallen.
Oof.
I feel so vindicated right now.
People.
I think Revenge of the Fallen was done during the writer's strike, so I think it was actually Michael Bay wrote most of that movie.
Yeah, but it's got a lot of Kurtzman orgy DNA on it.
They're all from the same gene pool, really. I apologize to their family
members. They're all the same person. Let's not kid ourselves. There's a reason you've never seen them in the same place at the same time.
All right, are we done with this fuck show that is Star Trek V? Can we move on?
I just have to go through my points here. Don't worry, there are not many of them. William Shatner, in all honesty, as much as people make fun of how hammy he can be, and he can be hammy, is, I think, a legitimate great actor.
It's a crying shame he got memed into oblivion. I'm not saying he's not to blame. I give, I can't remember the showrunner now.
David E. Kelly.
That's it. Yeah. I give that man a lot of credit for Boston Legal in particular because it gave everyone an entirely different perspective on Shatner and got to show his acting ability. Also reintroduced Betty White to popular culture, which has been nothing but a blessing to the world, I think, at this point.
I remember her in Lake Placid. She was pretty funny in that.
Shatner, legitimate great actor, total diva, even by his own admission. He's someone who's best kept in front of the camera.
Yeah.
Creative control and Will Shatner, I'm sorry, sir. Heck of respect to you as a fellow Canadian. You are a great actor, which he was in front of the camera on. You are a great actor. As a director, you are a great actor.
For the record, if anyone out there listening has not seen the documentary series he did, The Captains, which is him interviewing the people who played the captains on the various Star Trek properties, it's a really interesting series he did.
It's fantastic.
The best thing that came out of that entire thing was I did not know that he and Patrick Stewart were such good friends, because their friendship, that is just one of the most pure, joyful things I've ever seen, is them interacting.
Interestingly enough, I think probably one of the guys he's also friends with is Jonathan Frakes.
Wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I think those two are a lot closer in personality, and there's a couple of good scenes with them with Chaos on the Bridge where you can definitely tell there's a little bit of, no, we call each other on our crap.
So a special shout out goes to Nichelle Nichols, who had to do that horrible fan dance.
Oh, God.
Which apparently was just based off of a sarcastic remark, like, we need some way of distracting the guards. Like, well, what? Get Nichelle to, like, do a fan dance? Brilliant. Let's do it. No, that was a joke. Let's get the fans. To you, Miss Nichols, if this ever reaches your ears, we thank you for your great service. You are a true professional in your dedication to the craft, and we apologize for all you have had to endure from that experience.
Weirdly, years later, when Quentin Tarantino does Jackie Brown, we'll go through the same thing again, only be a slightly more contextually better.
So this is part... Go ahead. Okay, well...
You go ahead. This is a Canadian disagreement, by the way. Who's going to let the other one go first?
Yeah, this is a Canadian standoff. The one small jewel, the speck of light in this field of complete and total darkness
that we trek into.
Yeah, don't make that joke until first contact. Is Kirk talking to Sybok, where Sybok goes to remove his pain, and Kirk says, "No, stop, I need my pain." That is the one good nugget of decency in this entire endeavor, is Kirk knows that even the things that we hate about ourselves, the painful things that have happened in our life, those are a part of us as we are now, and to remove them would be to remove that aspect of ourselves that it could even have unfortunate consequences. I forget the episode title, but it's a TOS episode where Kirk gets separated into like all of his quote-unquote positive emotions and quote-unquote negative emotions in a transporter accident. And the first thing they do is they lock up the negative emotions because he's basically a violent rapist psychopath. He's basically just like this wild animal running around the ship screaming, "I'm Captain Kirk!"
You know they're the evil parts of him because they wear extra eyeliner.
Sadly, he did not have a goatee. That would have been too on point. And then they get the good Kirk, but then I forget exactly, they get attacked by Romulans or something. And then when the good Kirk goes on the bridge, he's like, well, let's just give them what they want. Let's be nice to them. Because again, all that parts of him that sort of made him the kind of guy that could spit in the face of authority, tell the Romulans to go shove it up their backside, to get in a staring match with a super-powered machine intelligence intent on annihilating all life in the galaxy, and the machine blinks. That comes from that negative aspects of him. If you have either or, the positives or the negatives, both are bad exclusively by themselves, but merged together, they kind of make the Captain Kirk that works. So I kind of thought that was a nice little touch. But other than that, it's just such a terrible film. I own all the Star Trek movies except for 1 and 5. Pretty much the only Star Trek movie that I will never own if I can help it.
All right, now let's talk about Star Trek VI, The Apology.
After Shatner really trashed things with Star Trek V, Leonard Nimoy got the keys to the kingdom back again, and we get to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. By this point, the Soviet Union had fallen, and Leonard Nimoy decided that would actually be a neat idea for a movie. Let's do, the Berlin Wall coming down in space, and sort of the political ramifications of that, of a former enemy becoming ally, and the ability to let go of old rivalries and be supportive into a new era, and the fight back on that. He sort of cited the Israel-Palestine conflict of whenever they come close to making a peace agreement, the fighters on both sides assassinating their own leadership to keep the war going. So it turns out the one thing that they can bond over is their desire to kill each other. Star Trek VI, it starts off, there's an explosion at Praxis.
Don't worry, it was only 36 Rontgens. Not great, not terrible.
So we have the Excelsior, which is finally in service, captained by Sulu, the closest ship that tries to respond to the disaster, where the Klingons say, "Explosion? What explosion? Everything's perfectly fine in the glorious empire of Klingon."
I'm fine. Everything's fine here. How are you?
We have always been at war with Eurasia. Wow. We got
basically,
4 different references out of that one bit. I'm proud of us.
it's almost like this is a really well done movie. Praxis exploding has crippled the energy industry of the Klingon Empire. They can no longer afford to spend as much resources on their Cold War with the Federation. So Spock says, we need to negotiate a peace agreement to de-escalate the war so that we can transition to a period of peace and coexistence with the Klingons. Kirk says, what a hoot. One of the admirals is like, let's wait for them to be on their knees, then we'll negotiate. Spock counters with, well, if they think that's going to happen, they may as well just start the war now while they're at their maximum strength. And if it works, great, we win. If not, die in a blaze of glory, which, is what the Klingons are really into anyway. Spock nominates Kirk and the Enterprise to negotiate with the Klingons under the advice of the ancient Vulcan saying only Nixon could go to China, as in Kirk is so unabashedly against the Klingons that the Klingons could have no distrust of him because they know he honestly hates them.
There's no possible duplicity here.
So they meet up with Kronos 1, see what they did there. They meet up with the Klingon Progressive Chancellor Gorkon. After a very unsuccessful diplomatic dinner where they're all sniping at each other, the Klingons claim that Shakespeare was a Klingon, which kind of ruffles everyone's feathers. As they're recovering from the disaster of the dinner, the Enterprise apparently fires 2 torpedoes onto the Klingon ship, disabling its gravity systems. 2 crew members beam over in spacesuits and assassinate the Chancellor. The Klingons manage to get their ship back in operation. General Chang threatens to kill them. Kirk immediately surrenders to try and defuse the situation. He says he'll beam over as a hostage. Before they beamed over, Spock put a transmitter on Kirk so they know where he is. And McCoy beams over to try and save the life of Gorkon. He ultimately fails. There's a trial. They play Kirk's log entry where he claims that he does not trust Klingons, never will. He will never forgive them for the death of his boy. They're pretty much declared guilty and sentenced to Rurapente, the Klingon ice asteroid mine.
To Siberia.
During his time at Rurapente, Kirk kind of realizes that he had never bothered to even entertain the possibility that Gorkon might be honest and actually working for peace, and thinks that maybe he's just an old soldier who can't let go of old prejudices, and that set the stage for him being set up for killing him. Has his sort of come to Jesus moment that maybe we should give peace a chance. Him and McCoy try and escape from Rurapente, get out of the transporter blocker field. The crew of the Enterprise have managed to stave off going back into space dock so that they can continue to work to figure out what the heck's been going on. They eventually find the 2 crew members that were responsible for the assassination, but it turns out they've been assassinated now, so there's another assassin who also altered the Enterprise computer banks to make it look like they had fired those torpedoes, even though they counted them all manually. They didn't fire any torpedoes. Spock concludes that the only way that they could have fired is if another ship invisibly fired from underneath them, which leads to the possibility that there is a Klingon ship that can fire while cloaked, which up to this point has been impossible. Kirk, with the help of a shape-shifting alien, him and McCoy are able to get out of the transporter, but oh no, it's been a setup so that they can get them killed trying to escape. But just before the villain explains their evil plan, Spock beams them up. So now that the gang's all back together, they need to find who the saboteur is above their ship. They do a false announcement that the assassins have been actually brought back to life by McCoy. So when the assassin comes back to finish the job, they catch her, and it's Valeris. Spock forcibly mind melds with her to get the information that senior members of both the Klingons and the Federation, including Admiral Let the Klingons Die and Chang, as well as the Romulan ambassador, because Romulans are all part of this. Better to have the war now and finish off the Klingons than to risk a world of peace where they could stab us in the back, and the Klingons vice versa. So they find where the new peace talks are being held, and they go to save President Foreman. Kirk jumps him off the stand. Scotty pushes the would-be assassin out of a window. Michael Dorn figures he's not a Klingon. Turns out it's Admiral Odo. Kirk gives a nice speech about the undiscovered country being what Gorkon referred to as the future. Everyone has their big swelling music. Everyone claps. The crew returns to the Enterprise and then are informed that they must report for decommissioning as the ship is now too old, even though they just got a new one in the last movie. Spock says to hell with that. Kirk says, set a course, second star to the right, straight into morning, and the ship sails gracefully off into the sunset. The perfect ending of a great career of an amazing crew. Mark, what did you think of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country?
This is the second movie I showed my 9-year-old daughter. It's probably the second or third best in the entire run of Kirk movies. I don't count Generations, one because it's hot garbage, two because it's really a Next Generation movie. Yeah, it's probably Star Trek II, The Wrath of Kahn, then it's probably this one. This has got a great cast in it. It's a super fun movie that kind of revolves around a mystery, who shot the Klingon. So, it's like, hey, we've done a great one, we've done a sci-fi one, we've done an action one, we've done a bad one, we've done a comedy. Why don't we do a murder mystery? And it really does pull the nose up from a complete crash and disaster for the series. Sends everybody out on a positive note. There's nothing really embarrassing in this one. It's a solid entry into the wide berth of Star Trek movies. And I just thought it was a great one for that particular crew to go out on. I don't have any major complaints about it. I don't have any major criticisms. Everything works. Christopher Plummer as Chang. Yeah, he's wonderfully hammy. Half of his lines are Shakespeare quotes or quotes from elsewhere. I still do the Hitler 1938 bit. We need breathing room. Hitler 1938. Well, we still have a long way to go, don't we? There's a lot of really great, funny lines in it. When they're up on the starship and they're actively dealing with the Klingons, the movie moves really fast. When they get to Siberia, it's a little on the slow side, but they don't stay there very long. Overall, I wish there had been more like this one and less like 5. It's a shame they started as late as they did with these movies, because I feel like had they started a little bit earlier, there might have been some gas in the gas tank, and we might have had some more solid entries. On the other hand, we might have had more like 5, and I'd be like, I wish they had stopped these sooner. So who knows, in an alternate universe, what another few Star Trek movies would have been like. Either way, solid, fun entry. I really don't have anything more to add than that.
Robert, you're up next.
If Star Trek 4 is like a deliberately bad Star Trek script saved by good performances, this is good fanfic. It takes the characters that we all kind of know and love, if you know and love them. It puts them in believable positions. It plays to all of their strengths. There's a decent enough little mystery that goes on, a bit of political intrigue, and it all concludes in fairly typical Star Trek-y fashion. I don't have a tremendous amount of complaints. I mean, again, there is stuff to complain about, but this is so very much within the confines of the genre, and not just the genre in general, but the Star Trek genre specifically, that if it didn't have those flaws, it wouldn't actually fit as well as it does. So I can live with all of it. Again, not my favorite, but I know why it's so highly respected and thought of, and it was the appropriate way to send off this group of people, I think.
Andrew, take us home.
I'm actually going to go in a slightly different direction, and I'm going to admit my own bias, because this is the first Star Trek movie I ever saw in theaters. This is actually one of my all-time favorite Star Trek movies, and I'd probably put this as my favorite among the first 6. Sorry, Mark. Now, granted, I think on rewatching, some of the elements don't work as well. I think definitely, now that I understood what the Cold War was and everything like that, some of those references are a little bit hammy. But I think everything else about this movie really works, and I think it serves a lot of the underlying elements of it. For example, when you talk about the element of aging that was talked about in Star Trek II, and this had the same director, I think on some level that talked about the concept of aging, and this talked about the consequences of aging. The one line I always remember out of this one is at the conversation between Kirk and Spock before the final space battle, and Spock turning to Kirk and saying, "Is it possible that we've outlived our usefulness?" And really kind of wrestling with some of those opinions and biases and things like that. And I think thematically that was really strong within the movie, and kind of the elements of moving on. On the craft side of things, the mystery/conspiracy works fairly well. The one thing that gets me on this movie that works so well is kind of the elements of tension. And I think that's done through the cinematography, through the music. The score on this is great and really adds to that element. It really just all kind of works in service of the film, in service of keeping attention on the audience. And yeah, the Rura Pente stuff is a little bit slow, but I mean, it also gives that little pause in the movie to breathe a little bit as it moves forward. I'd say performances throughout this movie are universally pretty awesome. I mean, we can talk about, I made a comment about Christopher Plummer being hammy, but that's because I absolutely love this performance, all the way down to him quoting Shakespeare. And of course, my all-time favorite moment of that is during the final space battle when he spins in his chair and screams, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war," which
I'd give real money if he'd shut up.
Damn it, Mark, you beat me to it.
That entire sequence works so well, and I think it just works. It's one of my favorite Star Trek movies, and yeah, there's not a lot to be said about it. I will give one piece of absolutely silly trivia. This was a little bit of a role reversal for Kirk and Christopher Plummer. They had a previous professional relationship where William Shatner was actually Christopher Plummer's understudy at the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario. Everyone in Canadian acting basically does a tour at Stratford at some point.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I could quite say 6 tops 2, but I think it's a solid rival. Anyone who says, I think 6 is the best movie instead of 2, I have no qualms with that opinion. I think it is the most solid of the original series cast films alongside Wrath of Kahn. There's, some little issues here. Like I find it so funny that when they're at dinner with the Klingons and they make a shot about everything being about humanity, you think that humans just know everything, and the sort of lack of acknowledgement that the Federation is this alliance of like 150 different species, of which humans are just one.
You have the Klingons like, the Federation is so bad, and the Federation is such a humanist. The Federation has one contingency of humans, and the rest is all aliens. What the fuck are you people talking about?
The president isn't even a human.
No, the president. I don't think the president's been human since the start of the motion picture. So, like, that whole scene, while I like the movie, that's my one complaint about it. Like, that scene makes no sense whatsoever.
I think that scene makes perfect sense when you think about, when you're dealing with the Soviets and the fact that if you dump enough propaganda on a population that they'll believe anything.
Fair enough.
As far as I know, the Federation there's not really a top dog. It's all this supposed to be this sort of equilateral alliance of people. It's kind of like the United Nations, but it actually works.
Sorry, I've seen the later movies. You're not going to sell me on the Federation actually working. Look, if they're not encountering random space alien of the week, it's some bureaucratic nightmare within either Starfleet or the Federation at large.
Yeah, sure. Starfleet Academy is headquartered on Earth. The Federation shipyards are, orbiting Mars. Unless, again, you're watching Star Trek Picard, then apparently it's all on the surface. I understand that, the reason why everyone is human is because they're the cheapest people to put in the show. It's hard to make alien makeup all the time just for extras. The whole idea of, as opposed in Star Trek 2, where it's more the characters dealing with like physically aging, like I'm just getting old, I don't know if I can still do my job, whereas the Undiscovered Country is more about everything other than me is changing now. The politics, our friends, our enemies, it's all becoming different. This is not the world that we used to live in. Now it's a different world, and I don't know what we're supposed to do in it. And it ends with it just saying, well, let's get it set up and leave it to the next generation.
Yeah, clever wordplay.
I think it works good in the sense that it keeps things general enough, even though it is based on the end of the Cold War. The sort of idea of seeing a former enemy as a ally, or at least as not an enemy anymore, and sort of how scary that can be on both sides. You spend all this time hating each other and preparing to kill each other if you have to, and then it's like, oh wait, no, we want to be friends now. It's like, is this a trick? It's a very interesting setup. Seeing these characters get to the end point of their arcs, you have at the beginning where Spock's talking to Valerum and he says, logic is not the end of understanding, but the beginning. It sort of shows Spock's growth throughout the series and the films, having sort of reconciled being amongst, these emotional species, but also retaining his logic, which is completely undermined in Discovery, where they have him saying that right at the start. Even like the little bit at the end where Spock asks McCoy, would you like to assist me in doing surgery on a torpedo? And McCoy says, fascinating, kind of poking fun at the way Spock responds to things, but also like, yeah, let's do this. Best friends, fixing torpedoes, blowing up the enemy. It's kind of this nice sort of like, no, they really are friends. They do get together, even if they're ideologically opposed to each other on many things. Kind of be nice if we had a bit more of that.
You ain't wrong.
And the ship combat too. I skipped it in the summary, but yeah, where they actually have the Excelsior and the Enterprise fighting with Chang's firewall cloaked bird of prey. It's not the most dynamic. It's not explosions all over the place and lasers all over the place and people running and screaming and intensity. But every time something happens, it hits you hard. I just remember even in Wrath of Kahn, like, oh man, now we can't use the shields anymore. What are we going to do? And just seeing like the Enterprise going past the camera, wounded with the holes blown through the saucer section with the arcs there, it's gut-wrenching. Oh no, she's wounded, she's hurt, people are probably dead. What are they going to do? As opposed to like the later films where it's just pew 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 pew, boom 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 boom, and I have no idea what the heck's going on here. I think that it really shows how space battles in Star Trek should be done. Again, the sort of like submarine fights, but in space. To sort of sum it all up, you get to the end of the film where they start doing the credit roll, and you have them doing the traced signatures of all the cast. I remember end of Endgame seeing them do the same trick, and it's just you earned it, guys. You earned it. Just that same sort of graceful end of an era. It's just a beautiful end to things. And this was actually the first Star Trek film I bought on DVD. I think it was the first one I bought at all since I've added the rest. But Star Trek 6 is really high in my books and well worth a watch by anyone.
My daughter liked it.
Any final thoughts on the original series, movies?
There are 3 sets of movies to compare. You have the Kelvin timeline, you have the Picard series, and you have this one. And I have to say, and maybe people would attribute this to age bias, whatever, but I think this is the strongest set of movies in total. The J.J. Abrams Kelvin ones are more action-adventure in space. They're not really Star Trek. I mean, again, the last one ends with them shooting aliens to the sounds of the Beastie Boys. They've lost the plot. They've lost the meaning of Star Trek. They're fun if you don't think about them and you don't think about Star Trek.
If you've suffered enough head trauma, I'm sure they kill time.
The Picard movies are also very hit and miss. Everyone jerks themselves off over First Contact, but there's a lot more wrong, I think, in the Picard ones than there are right. There are 6 movies, and maybe one of them is the worst thing ever captured on film. The rest of them are good and or have problems, but are mostly good. And that's why I think they're the best set of movies and the ones the most worth talking about. If you grew up with TNG and more so grew up with those movies, there's an argument to be had over what they mean to you and the quality or whatever. As somebody who grew up with the Kirk movies, but can also look at them honestly, I really do feel like it's the strongest set of movies most resembling Star Trek.
Robert, any final thoughts?
This particular set of 6 movies is a story of highs relative to the franchise and shocking lows relative to anything approximating cognitive thought. When it's good, it's really good. Wrath of Kahn is, by pretty much any reasonable measure, a good movie. Star Trek 6, by any approximation of the Star Trek franchise, is a good movie. I think where I might favor the Picard set over the Kirk set probably comes from a couple of points. One is number of films. 6 movies is, I don't think there's any film property that can really sustain that many films. Even if you look at stuff in the MCU, if you were to take any random sampling of 6 movies in that group, you're going to find duds. It's just inevitable. No one bats 1,000 over 6 films, especially if we're reusing characters and doing a lot of similar storylines in places. The misses here are pretty bad. You have an opening movie that's slow and pretentious and lethargic, and just you have to really be in the right kind of headspace to watch it all. You have 3, which is goofy. You have 4, which, if the comedy doesn't work for you, is a chore of all chores to get through. You have 5, which is a grandiose pile of crap, which almost has to be seen to be believed. And then you have 6, which is a combination fanfic / love letter to the franchise. There's highs, there's lows. Curate your consumption of these 6 films and you can find yourself a good time. But there's just real diminishing returns whenever you deal with this much spent with the same people doing essentially the same thing.
Andrew, final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably agree that if you had to, pick and choose from every one of the 3 blocks of Star Trek movies, this one has probably the collectively strongest entries. I mean, I'd say, probably the best for me and still the single best for me is still First Contact. But again, you go to the Next Gen series and it just, the overall quality of all of those 4 movies just isn't there with the exception of First Contact.
Much as I stand up for Insurrection, I can see the point.
And then the Kelvin ones, I really enjoy the first and the third one. I mean, we've had this conversation. Into Darkness is hot garbage, but definitely not as kind of having that really good trifecta of action, thoughtful sci-fi.
Thank you all very much for listening. Are there any plugs? Do we even want to pretend there's a schedule at this point?
Hey, thanks for joining us here on David's inaugural Star Trek podcast. You can check out future episodes of this one and all Radulich Broadcasting Network podcasts on the W2M network. Just open up your podcast catching app and type in W2M Network. You'll see the red WM and a teal 2 in there. You'll see all of our podcasts, Damn You Hollywood, Source Material Live, TV Party. 90% of what we're doing these days is TV parties. Metal Hammer of Doom. It's all there. If you're seeing video games or the kickoff, that's not us, but they're part of the W2M network as well. You can look for more of David's Star Trek Retrospective podcast right here on the Radulich Broadcasting Network. under the umbrella of WTM.
On a slightly different podcasting network, you can catch me most Sundays on the 411 Ground and Pound MMA podcast, where we take a look into the wide, wacky, wonderful world of mixed martial arts. That show goes up pretty much every week. We talk about news, we talk about the fights that happened, we preview the fights that happened. A good time is had by all. Andrew was on a recent episode. I most recently eulogized the career of Joseph Benavidez because he done got killed by the God of War. Please, if you're into the sport, check me out there. I'm on a couple of TV parties. I'm the usual host of Damn You Hollywood, so I hope to see all of you there on those particular shows going forward. Thank you for listening to this one. We deeply appreciate you. Please share us around. Mark's a big advocate of free use, so tell your friends about us if you think they're interested in the material. Thank you very much in advance for all of that.
So if you're in the Calgary area, I train martial arts currently at Havoc JKD and Esteem Martial Arts in Calgary. So please come check us out. We are, as we're still in kind of stage 2 of reopening, we are offering socially distanced classes. You can you can find out the studio on Facebook and on by any of your search engines. I'd also urge you to go check out my instructor's podcast, The Bang of the Hound, featuring my instructor Jay Cooper. It's mainly a martial arts kind of discussion podcast forum. They did have a really great one with Officer D. Burton a couple of weeks ago that, given some recent items, I would thoroughly suggest everyone checking out as well. Other than that, guys, thank you as always for having me on.
Always a pleasure. Yeah, this is our first episode of the Star Trek Retrospective. We plan on going through pretty much all the series, all the movies, when we have time. Today, Red Letter Media announced that they are doing their own Star Trek Retrospective, so I'd like to point out we're first. Ha!
That depends entirely on when this gets out, not when we recorded it.
Oh, no. It was announced first. This has been announced for like 2 months already.
That's true.
So we announced it first. So
we're getting ripped. Hey, finally, we're the ones getting ripped off instead of the other way around.
Exactly. They get to quote us instead of us quoting them.
It was actually another case of Radulich and Broadcasting beating someone else to the punch. Basically, you guys beat the Escapists to doing a long road to ruin on the Fast and the Furious series.
Perfect.
So until next time, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.